Welcome, everybody. I'm a part of Northampton Neighbors, the Speakers Committee, and we have gone to Zoom speakers since May, and we have speaker sessions every other Friday. And so it's been wonderful. A lot of people have joined us, and it's another way that Northampton Neighbors tries to keep social interaction going. We're very happy today that Katharine Baker is going to speak to us about my journey, how one woman survived Stalin's Gulag. I just wanted to make a couple of other announcements, and that is our next speaker is going to be Judy Dixon on the 25th of September. And she is an amazing tennis pro who played doubles with Billie Jean King, but she's done a lot of even more significant things. And she'll be speaking. And then our very own Mike Carpel will be speaking on October 9th. And I got just a short preview of what he's going to speak about, and it's amazing art imaginations that people are doing, and it's phenomenal. So I think that everyone will enjoy that greatly. I want to introduce Katharine, but I want to shorten it because Katharine has a lot to say, and her resume is very, very long. So she has done research. She's a clinical social worker. She's been a principal of a couple of businesses that does organizational consulting. She's also studied Russian culture and certainly the Stalin repression. She's published numerous books, loads of articles and chapters in books. And I, for one, but I think many of us Northampton neighbors didn't realize that she knew Russian and was translating a Russian book. But her best claim to fame, I think, is the fact that she is one of the co-founders of Northampton Neighbors. So we really salute you and the co-founders and the board who put our organization together. So I think I'll end there and turn it over to Katharine for a wonderful talk. Welcome, Katharine.
Thank you, Sarah. And it is true, if you live a long time, that your resume just gets longer and longer. So I apologize for giving you that whole thick pack of list of things. I'm also very grateful to Northampton Neighbors for giving me this opportunity to talk about Olga Sliozberg, who I'm sure you will find a very interesting person. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And you'll see the book. This is the book. Here's what I'm going to be talking about today. Push the right arrow. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about Olga, show you some photographs, give you some context for her memoir. And then I'm going to give you some very brief thoughts on translations, and then I'll do some readings from the book because that's really what's most important. So who was Olga Sliozberg? This, going back to the cover, this is a photograph of her at the age of 31. And you can see she's just a beautiful young woman, intellectual, living in Moscow at that time in the early 1930s. So she was born in Samara, which is a town down in south central Russia on the Volga River, born into an Orthodox Jewish community. Her parents were both tailors. They were not intellectuals, but the whole family moved to Moscow in 1918, just the year after the revolution. It was a pretty chaotic time there. But I think they moved there in order to give her and her siblings a chance to get some education. And she enrolled in the economics faculty at Moscow State University, and that was her field. About 10 years later, she married Yudel Ruvimovich Zachheim, and she was 26 years old. Here's a photograph of him. He's the upper left is Yudel in the early 30s. He was a biologist, a professor of biology at the Moscow State University. And these are pictures of him after he was arrested. Those are kind of mugshots. So as I said, Olga was an economist. Udell was a professor of biology. Neither of them were members of the Communist Party. They were part of the Moscow intelligentsia and very sympathetic to the social and economic goals of communism, as were many educated Russians in that post-revolutionary period. They had 2 children. Their son was born in 1930 and their daughter was born in 1932. So those 2 were 6 and 4 years old at the time that both parents were arrested in 1936. And here's a picture of Olga with the children. Yeah, so this is 1933, the picture on the left, and 1935, the picture on the right. So 2 little, very tiny children who suddenly lose both your parents. In 1936, Udell was arrested. There was no warning. It was completely shocking. People came in the night and took him away. No explanation. He was 37, almost 38 years old. And then, and you can read all about this if you do read the memoir, because she describes it in a lot of detail. She was arrested at the age of 34, 2 months later. There were no specific charges against Udell that anyone ever found out, but apparently Stalin thought that he and millions of others were potential political dissidents in the mid-1930s. Stalin was consolidating his power then, and he was just eliminating a lot of people he thought could disrupt his power. Not that Udell could have, he was a professor of biology, but that happened. Olga was later told that his sentence was 10 years without the right of correspondence. And that was a euphemism that they used to tell family members that the person arrested had been shot within 24 hours. She didn't know that at the time, but she learned that later. Olga herself was accused. Her accusation was terrorism and plotting to murder Kaganovich, a high-level Communist Party leader, and she was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. The Gulag being a network of concentration camps that were established all around the country by Stalin, not just in Siberia, but there were gulags right in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, yeah. And it was a way that Stalin thought he could contain potential political dissidents. Olga was incredibly fortunate that her parents took care of her children. In many of her children and her parents, her mother on the bottom right, most children whose parents had been arrested, they were called enemies of the people. That was what arrested people were called. And most of those children were small children were put in orphanages and their names were changed. So it was extremely hard to get back or find your children. Eventually, when you were released from the Gulag, to find your children was almost impossible and very tragic for these families. Millions of people were arrested from the early 30s up until the start of the Second World War, and then later again in the post-war period. Most were arrested on the kind of trumped up charges that Olga was charged with. The idea of her being plotting the murder of Kaganovich is just ridiculous, absurd. About 10 to 15% of the political prisoners in the Gulag were women, and they were kept in their own separate prison cells and barracks. If you want to learn more about the Gulag, I recommend Anne Applebaum's very comprehensive book called Gulag. It was published in 2003. I can show that to you when we get off the slides. So here is a map of Olga's places of imprisonment. She was born, as I said, in Samara. Hopefully you can see that little cursor on there. When she was 16, the family moved to Moscow. And then when she was arrested, she was first arrested in Lubyanka, which is kind of the famous prison in Moscow. And then she was sent off to Solovki, which is up here in the north, near the White Sea, very, very cold, very far north. Then she was transferred to Kazan here in central Russia. and then to a prison in Suzdal. I have some nice photographs of that because I've been to Vladimir and Suzdal, but I'll see if I have time. But then she was about 3 or 4 years into her imprisonment. She was put on a train, a freight train, and sent off here to Kolyma, and was in Elgin eventually. That's where her barracks were. So it's a 34-day trip in a cold, unheated freight car, jammed with prisoners. Then she was out there for 10 years. After her first sentence was completed, she got permission to visit her family back in Moscow because her parents by then were very frail and elderly. And she stayed with them sort of semi-illegally for about 3 years until 1949. In 1949, there was a kind of a sweep of all former prisoners through Moscow, getting ready for a big celebration of Stalin's 70th birthday. And Olga was rearrested and exiled to Kazakhstan, down here to Karaganda. That's where she ended up spending the next 10 years. Stalin died in 1953, and 3 years later, after a leadership succession struggle, Khrushchev, who was the winner of that struggle, as you undoubtedly remember, gave a secret speech to the party's Central Committee about Stalin's atrocities. And at that point, he granted amnesty to all political prisoners who were then held in the Gulag, including Olga. She returned to Moscow and was rehabilitated in 1956. And she was given a certificate that said that, quote, her case was canceled for lack of evidence, unquote. She writes in the memoir that she lost 20 years and 41 days of her life because of this mistake. She spent the next 35 years living with her children and grandchildren in Moscow, as well as connecting with old friends, people she'd gotten to know in the Gulag, and many of them wrote memoirs together with her, although hers was certainly the most elegant and well put together. Here's a picture of Olga when she was 88, 89. She died at 89 in 1991 of pneumonia. She died in her son's apartment. At that point, she was only sick for a week. She read without glasses. She had good hearing, and she took long walks every day right up to just a few weeks before she died. And I've seen a video of her at age 88. She's this little tiny bright-eyed person just talking about her experiences. She's quite a remarkable woman. So in terms of the memoir, Olga, very early on in the memoir, she describes how she wrote it in her head because prisoners were not allowed paper and pencil. So she lay there at night having trouble sleeping and wrote to herself what had happened that day and throughout her experience. She only wrote it down for the first time on paper in 1946 after her first release from prison. And then she buried it in the garden of her family's dacha in 1949, just before she was rearrested. 10 years later, after she was rehabilitated in 1956, she went back to the garden, dug and dug and dug at the dacha, but she couldn't find it. So she sat down and she wrote the whole thing all over again. It was widely circulated in the underground press, and Solzhenitsyn references it in Gulag Archipelago because it was such an outstanding and clear and accurate description of what had happened to a woman and her family during that period. It was not published in Russian until 2002, 11 years after her death. She said she wrote the memoir in order to explain to her children why their parents were arrested. She also wanted to bear witness to what had happened to her, her husband, and millions of others in Stalin's Soviet Union. The bearing witness is something that theme comes back in the memoir in very powerful and moving ways. The book was given to me in the original version of the book, not the published book, but another version of it was given to me in 1990, the mid-1990s, 94, I think, by one of Olga's grandsons, when I was in Moscow doing a research project on the children and grandchildren of Stalin's purge victims, since the grandchildren at that point were the midlife adults who were running the country in the 1990s. He was one of the subjects of our research study, and he told me that his grandmother's memoir might be helpful to me in understanding what these purge victims had lived through. He, of course, was right, but I didn't start the translation until about 8 years later, when I actually got the hard copy. I also met Olga's daughter when I was in Moscow. Here she is. The one who was 4 years old when her parents were arrested, brought up by her grandparents. Lovely person. I met her around the year 2000, and she told me a lot more stories about her mother, including the story about digging up the memoir in the garden and not finding it. But she so much wanted her mother's story to reach English language readers. So that further inspired me to launch into the translation project. In doing the translation, I hoped that a wider world of readers would come to understand what had happened to this average but completely innocent woman during the period of 1936 to 56 in the Soviet Union, and to pass on her witness to English language readers. The most challenging part of any translation is to capture the voice of the author while also making it comprehensible to readers from a different culture and with a different linguistic background. I did try to make word choices that would capture the tone of Olga's writing, which is very simple, direct, and archival. And every reference she makes to people or places in the book are all accurate. You know, they're all completely accurate, which is kind of remarkable because that's often not true of these memoirs. Okay, so I'm going to now do some reading. Hopefully I have time. This is one of the prisons that she was, it was an old convent, and I went there in the early 2000s. It's a beautiful old place. And she looked out the windows, and this is one of her views, and she reads about it. This is Suzdal. This is the train. I thought I'd just start by reading you this piece about her experience on the 34-day trip across the country to Siberia from Suzdal. In our freight car, there were 70 people. We talked unceasingly. Exchanges with such a mass of people was intoxicating after 3 or 4 years of prison isolation. At last, it was possible to speak out loud. We shouted and sang. If you stood on the bunks, you could look out a low, narrow crack that ran like a window along the whole side of the freight train. During the transit, I finally heard Liza sing. Liza was someone who'd been in the cell with her in Kazan. She really had an unusual voice. The timbre was pure gold. She sang without any strain, like an overflowing river. I'd never heard a better performance in my life of the folk songs she sang. Ashkhab, a Tatar woman from Kazan, traveled with us. This was an almost illiterate woman, the mother of 6 children. Why she was imprisoned, I do not know. She never spoke of it. She was very active, arranged an isolated and comfortable little place for herself, and was immediately ready for business. She pulled thread out of an old blanket, procured 2 sticks from which she made knitting needles, and began to knit a jacket. When I asked her whom she was knitting it for, she answered, "Are you stupid or what? When we get to the camps, I will trade it for bread or sugar." And I hadn't thought it would be possible to trade things for bread or sugar. Ashkhab knew how to get along. When everyone had quieted down, this busy Ashkhab sometimes sang songs from the Far East in a sweet, high voice, songs full of such sadness and charm that one wanted to cry. Among us, there were many storytellers. Galia Ivanova knew many poems of Pushkin by heart, all of Yevgeny Onegin, Woe from Wit by Griboyedov, and Lieutenant Schmidt by Pasternak. Olga Radovich recited splendidly. Natasha Onufrieva recited The Idiot by Dostoevsky word for word. She told it over 3 days. Once at a stopping point while Galia Ivanova was reciting Woe from Wit, the commander of the convoy and 3 soldiers came into our freight car. They apparently had been listening, quickly opened the door and wanted to confiscate the book because books were not permitted. We said there was no book. The commander grinned and answered that with his own ears he had heard someone reading. They began a search. They turned over the whole car, but there wasn't a single book. Galia proposed that she would read to the commander without a book, and she began to recite the first line, "My uncle, high ideals inspire him." The commander stood there for 10 minutes, carefully looking around to see if someone wasn't showing her a book. Then he gave up, shrugged, turned, and went out. All the same, it seemed to him that we had tricked him. So we kept busy with literature and singing. No one spoke about our cases or about politics. Everyone was glad that they had removed us from prison and that we were going to a camp. But we were frightened and repulsed by any word that might be construed as political. One evening during some long stage of our trip, the lock to the doors of the freight car that separated us from the whole wide world flew off because of the jolting. It was sunset. The vast steppe lay there in full blossom. Into the stinking, suffocating air of the overcrowded carriage poured the broad breath of the steppes with its aroma of grass and flowers. We stood stock still. And then suddenly a hysterical voice sounded out. "Guards, guards, close the door." The train was moving and nobody heard. The voice sounded again. "We must rouse the guards. They will think that we did this ourselves, that we wanted to run." But no one wanted to run. People could run who were connected with the criminal world or with political organizations. But what, for example, could I do if I were given freedom but no passport? My dreams went no further than the apartment on Petrovka Street in Moscow. But anyway, they would take me from Petrovka the next day and return me to prison with a doubled sentence. So we stood silent and gazed at freedom, lying there just beyond our outstretched hands. At a small station nearby, the door was shut and our vision of freedom disappeared. I don't remember if it was in Sverdlovsk or Irkutsk that we stood on a siding for a day and they led us into a disinfection station. It was a beautifully equipped establishment. We undressed downstairs and we were ready to go upstairs when we saw that the guards were standing along the staircase from bottom to top. We crowded together. Almost all of us stood there, eyes lowered with red spots on our faces. Of course, they were all naked at that point. I looked up and met the eyes of an officer, the head of the guards. He looked at me with a frown and said, "Well, come on, don't hang back." And suddenly I felt relieved. It seemed even funny to me. I spit on them. For me, they're no more than Vaska the ox, whom I was afraid of as a child, I thought. And impudently looking into the eyes of the guard, I was the first to go forward. Behind me came all the rest. And so we passed along the line of guards. Later, we discovered they'd done the same thing that day with 4 other groups of women from our train. Above on the landing, there was a mirror covering the whole wall. We hadn't seen ourselves in more than 3 years. All the same, we were women. And seeing the mirror, we ran to it in a crowd. I ran up to the mirror, and standing in the crowd, I could not figure out where I was. And suddenly, I saw the tired, sad eyes of my mother. Her hair streaked with gray, the familiar sad lines of her mouth. It was I. I stood there, my mouth wide open, and could not believe that I was no longer the young woman to whom people on the street would turn and call out, but this sad old woman who looked about 50. The chief of the guard shouted, come on, your group has 20 minutes to wash." We ran into the bathhouse and began to take wash basins for ourselves, secretly laundering some rags, starting, in other words, all the usual scramble of prisoners on a transport. But for a long time, I remembered the sad, tired face, the gray head, the eyes that gazed at me from the mirror, and tried to accept the thought that it was I. This is where they were going. This is Yakutia in Siberia. And here's a picture of the barracks. I got these pictures off the internet, so it may not be exactly where Olga was. But I'm going to read a excerpt from, let's see, where is it? From one of her work projects, where the women had to go out and cut down trees and pile them up. I worked at logging with Galia Porozovskaya as a teammate. At the beginning, she was stronger and more skillful than I, but gradually she began to lose strength. She worked more and more slowly, and we began finishing our general norm, which was 8 cubic meters a day for 2 people, stacking up branches and logs. And later, we got later and later, finishing later and later. Everyone was going home, but our stack wasn't yet collected, and we didn't have the strength to move faster. I was always the first to give up. Let's stop, Galia. We'll finish tomorrow. I can't do any more. Galia looked at me with the eyes of an exhausted horse and said, and the norm? Can you get along on 400 grams? If you fulfilled the norm, you got 600 grams of bread a day. And if not, you got 400 grams. This 200-gram difference determined whether we lived or died, because one could not live and work at 50 degrees below zero on 400 grams of bread a day. Oh yes, of course, the norms. Well, let's try and make one more effort. We stacked up the firewood, with me cheating unscrupulously, sticking snow and branches inside the pile. Galia pleaded with me, please don't. What if they find out? How shameful that we, former party members, are burying snow in the woodpile. Of course, Olga was not a former party member, but probably Galia was. Somehow or other, 8 cubic meters get stacked, and it's already completely dark, but we have to walk 5 kilometers to get home. And here we are trudging along the return road. The frost freezes your spine, your hands, and your face. It takes the fullest exertion of will to walk for an hour and a half or 2 along an empty forest road when each foot weighs a ton. When your knees shake from weakness and hunger, when the kerchief covering your face turns into an icy shield and makes breathing difficult. Oops, let me go here. This is the countryside they're walking through. But ahead are the warm barracks, hot soup, and 200 grams of heavy, damp, but tasty bread. Ahead is a rest on our bunks, friendly faces, a warm stove with a fire burning in it, and so we walk. Every day we leave our work later and later, and the road home gets longer because the clearing where we cut wood is farther and farther from the barracks. One day, Galia and I were walking in silence, hardly able to drag our feet. It was deathly cold. The moon was shining and reflected on the snow, lighting our way. We were already getting close to the camp when suddenly Galia fell flat on her back and lay there without moving. Galia, Galia, I tugged at her. I didn't know if she was dead or unconscious. Galia lay there lifelessly. There was no question of my lifting her because I didn't have enough strength for that. I tugged at her and pushed her, but got no answer. I took my hand out of my mitten in order to feel her pulse, but instantly froze my hand. I stuck it inside the front of my jacket, but it wouldn't warm up. It had no feeling. Gradually it began to hurt, and that meant it was alive, but I hadn't found out whether Galia had died or fainted. If she's died, they may just as well pick her up tomorrow, but now I must keep going or otherwise I too will freeze. But if she's alive, within an hour she'll turn into a piece of ice. I can do no more, and I decide to walk on rather than for both of us to freeze. I decisively take several steps on the road, and then I turn back. Galia, Galia! No answer. What am I to do? I shrug and again start walking in the direction of home, and again I turn back. Galachka, Galia! No answer. And suddenly I hear the squeak of a sleigh and the clattering of a horse on a parallel road about 200 meters from ours. I run, I scream, I stumble across. I fall out of breath from the frost, from screaming, from running. Finally, I get close to the driver who's hauling manure in his wagon. For God's sake, help, a woman is freezing. He's very unwilling. He too is freezing, tired, dreaming of the warm stove and soup and 200 grams of evening bread ration. I plead with him, I cry, I cling with my arms to his padded jacket when he wants to drive away. Swearing, he turns toward our road, and together we load Galia onto the manure. We go by foot because the poor horse is also barely alive. In about 15 minutes, we reach the barracks. Sit by the stove. Here's the barracks. Where is the barracks? Yeah, there. There are the barracks. We reach the barracks. We sit by the stove. We share our soup with our savior. He turns out to be a singer from Leningrad, also a prisoner. We talk about the theater, about music, and Galia, regaining consciousness, lies on the bunk, warms up, and tears stream from her eyes. That's the end of that one. And then I'm just going to read you a very, very short piece of what she wrote after she got her certificate, saying that all these years was just a mistake, that this is her certificate of rehabilitation. I went into my apartment from which the militia could no longer snatch me. There was no one at home, and I could cry without holding back. I cried for my husband, murdered in the basement of Lubyanka at the age of 37, in the full flower of his strength and talent. For my children who grew up as orphans, labeled children of enemies of the people. For my parents who died of sorrow. For 20 years of suffering. For friends who did not live to be rehabilitated and are buried in the frozen earth of Kolyma. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was striking, the passages that you read to us. I have to interrupt here just for a few moments, though, and change the feeling that at least I have, and I'm sure all of us have, by saying I forgot one event that's coming up, and that's a talent show. It's going to be Northampton Neighbors' first live performance, and we're looking for people who have old hobbies, new hobbies, to share with us what your talent is. Just 4 minutes long, and all of us will share and laugh and enjoy it. Please join us. It's going to be October 18th. If you have a talent that you can share, we really applaud it. Give Northampton Neighbors an email or a phone call. The second announcement I have to make is a wonderful one. One of our speakers was Paul Schul, and he's a wonderful photographer, and he donated Charlie's tractor. He donated it, and there was a raffle, and the raffle pulled in $1,480, which is just phenomenal. And the winner is Claire Higgins. I don't know if Claire is here today. Is Claire here? Congratulations. Now I have one technical thing to say, and that is while I'm speaking, if you go to your chat button at the bottom of the screen, you can write in any question you have for Katharine and just hit enter. And I will go through the questions and try to get as many of them to Katharine as possible. If we have time and the chat questions are done, we'll try to open it up to people just raising a hand. But we have quite a few people here and it's hard to see raised hands. So we appreciate the chat button. And then my final thing to say is that Northampton Neighbors now has more than 900 members. And even though we've had to go to a new reality during the pandemic, we're trying to do as many things as possible to keep people in their homes, aging in place, and having some fulfilling lives. We have the Speakers Bureau. We call more than 100 members every week, people who want us to just keep in touch with them. And we have stuff like a talent show. But we're one of the few groups of Northampton Neighbors, which is part of the Villages movement. There's over 350 across the country. We're one of the few groups that has no fees at all. We have no membership fee or charge for any service or for these speakers, but we rely on donations. We do as much fundraising as we can and writing grants, but donations really support us. So Nina's going to put up a screen for how you can donate. Whatever amount you can give is wonderful. If you can become a sustaining member so that you donate a little bit every month, that's really wonderful, because then we can plan on the dollars. But we want to keep going and bringing you wonderful speakers and events. And when we can ever see each other in person, we'll go back to as many services in person as well. I think that that covers it for me. And so I'm going to turn on my chat button and give it back to Katharine. And I do have some questions that people have. One question is, how did you discover this woman's story and choose to write about it or choose to translate it?
The story, the actual story, was the book, as I mentioned in my talk, was given to me by her grandson. And I was in Moscow and was very interested in learning about the families. After these people were arrested in Stalin's period of terror in the 30s, they did have children, and then they had grandchildren. And what was the impact? The study was a kind of a multi-generational family study of the impact of that kind of traumatic event on a long-term impact on a family. And so, as I said, her grandson was one of the subjects in the study, which the subjects we got from Memorial, which is a organization in Moscow, an NGO that has been working to collect information about people who were either killed or imprisoned in those purges. So that's how I got interested in the book. And then I didn't read it I didn't go back to it until, maybe 8 years later, when I was going back to Moscow and my Russian was a little rusty, and I thought I need to read something. And I started this book, and it's just such a powerful book that it just seemed like it would be a natural thing to make it English so that other people could really also learn about her and her experience.
Thank you. Another question is, when Olga returned to Moscow and was rehabilitated, what does rehabilitation mean in that context?
It means that she went before a court, the court that had sentenced her, and they reviewed her case, and they found out that there was nothing wrong. She was completely innocent. She'd done nothing. She wasn't a terrorist. And so they gave her back her life, her freedom. Her record was completely expunged. That's and there were millions of people who were rehabilitated by Khrushchev in 1956. These political prisoners were in the Gulag.
In spite of her many imprisonments over the 20 years, Olga seemed tremendously resilient.
Yeah.
In your resume, you do a lot of cross-cultural kinds of work. Are there cultural differences in abilities to be resilient, have you found? Sorry about the English.
I don't know if I would call them cultural, because, in every culture, in every society, there are very strong, resilient people who can manage the stressors of their anxiety, of their society. But she was quite extraordinary in, I think her family support meant a huge amount to her. She had a very close, connected family, very close to her siblings, as well as to her parents, and a very, very loving relationship with her husband and her children. And I think that helped sustain her. But she just had some extraordinary qualities. There are some descriptions in there of her reaching out to the other, particularly the young women. She kept thinking, this could be my daughter. you know, when a teenager was arrested for making some trivial remark, and then they were sentenced to 20 years in the Gulag. And she reached out to those children and those young women, and she had that real personal capacity to do that. There's an interesting research project by someone called Shelley Taylor, who looked at stress experienced by women. And the traditional way of looking at stress is to say that the response is fight or flight. And what Shelley found was that all the research on stress, all the subjects were men, and that fight or flight was tended to be more of a male response. And she and her studies found out that there is something that women do that's different. And she calls it tend and befriend. And Olga certainly is an example of that, because under this enormous stress, she took care of people, she tended to people, and she befriended. So the people that she knew from their experiences together, those who came back to Moscow, became her closest friends and connections. So I think that I wouldn't say, not all women are like that, of course, and not all men do fight and flight, but it's an interesting kind of additional way to look at how people deal with stress.
Someone who came in a little bit late asked how much education did Olga have?
She had a doctorate in economics from Moscow State University.
Another question is, a person said she was very impressed when you were reading. It was so eloquent. I forgot what listening to a translation. I forgot I was listening to a translation. Great work.
Well, good. That's nice. Thank you.
Another question said they were curious about the experience of translation. Oops.
Well, it's hard. It's very hard. As I said, you try to get the sound of taking from one language to the other and trying to speak like the kind of person you know that she was, and make it in a new language was hard. And I did get help. I have a very good friend in Amherst, a Russian woman who was working on her English. And we would go over this. And then I also talked to somebody on the telephone in Moscow over a period of time in the middle of the night. You know, there's 7 hours time zone difference. And she wanted to be called in the middle of the night. And we did a lot of reviewing of some of the words. There's language in it that there's a particular prisoner lingo that she sometimes uses when she's talking about how people said certain things. And of course, we don't have a version of that in English, so I've just translated it as English. But I got some insights into that in talking to this friend in Moscow also.
They also asked, did you read up about translation? Did you come upon any surprises when you were doing it? And how did you learn about the idea of translating?
Well, I've done translation before from other languages, so I'm sort of familiar with the experience of it. And I haven't read up on it, except that someone like Vladimir Nabokov, has translated a lot of Pushkin. And he believes that you should translate everything word for word. You should not accommodate it all to the reader in the second language. You know, that's a very extreme version of translation. And then there are others who move the work that you're translating completely into kind of a colloquial version of your own language. And for me, it seemed like it was important to do somewhere in the middle of that. That it's got to be understandable to English readers, but you've also got to communicate the tone of the person who wrote it in their own original language.
A real challenge.
Yeah.
Another question was the husband in prison for the same kind of crime or a supposed crime, and how different was his experience?
Well, he was shot within 24 hours of his arrest. They came in the night. They knocked, oh no, they didn't come in the night. That's right. A lot of them, they came in the night. But for him, she was at work. And when she came home, she found her apartment just completely torn apart. The children were there with a nanny who was taking care of them. everything, clothing, books, papers, everything strewn all over the apartment. And she said, what happened? And the nanny said, they got him, they came for him. And of course, there was nothing that they could pin on him at all, because he was just a biology professor. Really, there were no charges. And the use of the word potential is something that I've heard a lot in the writings of about the Gulag, that Stalin was after people who were potential political dissidents. But she never knew what he was charged with. And hers was a complete fantasy, the idea that she was a terrorist and plotting murder. But he never had a chance to defend himself. No one had a chance to defend themselves. It was a totalitarian state.
And how did you even get interested in Russian studies?
Well, that goes back a ways. How much time do we have? Yeah. No, when I grew up, I mean, I don't have a Russian heritage at all. But my mother in the 1930s was an actress, and she was invited to go to Moscow to a socialist realist theater festival. And she was very innocent and young and naive, and just thought this was a worker's paradise, that it was an absolutely wonderful place, and had a marvelous experience there. And later she came back and, married my father, and my brothers and sisters and I were born. But her interest in Russia was something she passed on, this experience she had. It was a family story. And she loved the Russian music. She loved the great Russian novelists, Russian art, so that was a theme. And then I also had a Russian violin teacher when I was in school and college, and I would go to his home and sit and have tea with him and his wife, and they talked Russian and began to teach me a little bit. So I got into the sound of the language and really loving it.
Are we going to hear you play your violin at the talent show?
Yes.
All right. I think that's it for questions, unless Nina, do we want to open it to anyone who wants to raise their hand at this point? Are you there, Nina?
I'm here. Sure. We can, if everyone goes into gallery view, we can see if there's any raised hands, and if you unmute yourself, we will know that you want to ask a question. And let's see, Lee has unmuted his or herself.
Hers. I'd love to ask a question. Yeah.
Okay.
Katharine, how has this work translating and this woman under trauma and stress inform your philosophy and work in family therapy? Because this is about a traumatized family.
Yeah, that's a good question, Lee. I mean, I was already a family therapist, and that's one of the reasons I went to Moscow to do that research project. And then the powerful experiences I had in talking to people who had actually, their grandparents had gone through the purge and had the experience, the impact on their families. And some of them were more resilient and some of them were less resilient. There was a whole group of people that didn't even know who their grandparents were, that had never heard a story about them, and had just kind of carried on in some way or other. And in some ways, those people turned out to be lower functioning. The higher functioning people, like Olga's grandchildren, were doing well. They were healthy, their children did well in school, they had fewer divorces. We had these little measurement tools. And then there was I remember one woman who turned out, there was a chest under her bed that had been there all through her childhood, and no one had ever looked at it. And while we were talking, she told me the story of eventually how, as an adult, she had inherited this chest and she opened it. And in there were letters from her grandfather, her grandmother, who were in the Gulag. And this was a huge revelation to her and got her more involved. Actually, she became a member of Memorial, which, as I said, is the NGO that's searching for the remains of these people, the memories. But the people at at the higher level, who are really good, well-functioning people, named their children after their grandparents. They knew family stories. They had photographs. They had minor memorabilia, anything that could have been saved. And even though their grandparents were enemies of the people, they were valued and honored. And the whole family had more self-respect and more solid groundedness than the people who had just sort of disconnected or cut off from the trauma. So I think, Lee, that's sort of a long answer, but really it confirmed a lot of what I really believe about how families function. And yet it was this extreme case that I've never, in my experience in the United States, never experienced anything like that. Thanks for that question.
Do we see any other questions?
Elaine Parmit and has her mic unmuted.
Yes, I'm wondering, in the time of terror in Russia now, with Putin and his terrible leadership, dictatorship, totalitarianism, whether these memoirs are blocked to Russians knowing about Stalin in the past.
That's a really interesting question, Elaine. What the readership is or what the book sales are. I mean, it used to be in Russia that books were, people just gobbled them up. You wrote a book and it had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of purchasers immediately, and bookstores everywhere. And I think now that they're more in the digital age, that's happening less. Whether or not they're reading the memoirs, maybe they are. I would imagine not too much. I think this is a long ago past now for contemporary Russia. You know, they have different kinds of struggles. And when someone like Putin is, in some ways in Russia, it's a familiar phenomenon. You know, they lived for many centuries with czars who had very similar styles of leadership as Putin. And what Russians do with that kind of leadership, either the czarist or the Stalinist or the other communist leadership, totalitarian leadership, is they gather in their kitchens with very, very few people. They have one or two incredibly close friends, and they have family, and they have tea and sometimes vodka far, far into the night. And that's where they feel safe. And they don't talk about anything personal to people that are outside that very, very close circle. That was a story that I heard when I first started going to Moscow in the 1980s, right at the end of at the beginning of the Gorbachev period, meeting with people, with other psychologists, and they said, you know, we've never talked to anybody who wasn't just in our little, you know, our little family bubble. I mean, maybe that's what we're going back to with COVID or something, but the sense of privacy and safety is very, very constrained. And I don't know about the readings, Elaine. I would imagine they're not reading much of the old. They may read the classics, you know, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I don't know if this memoir is widely read.
Katharine, I wanted to remind you to reiterate, if people didn't hear, about why people should be buying this book, besides the fact that it's a tremendous story.
Yes, I should tell you that all the royalties go to the family. I don't get any of the royalties. I made that very clear. It's Northwestern University Press. And I think you can get it on on Amazon. You probably get it at one of our local books or Broadside or something. But and it's not expensive. I don't even know what it is. $21.95. It's a good buy. This is also the book I mentioned about the Gulag and Applebaum. If anybody's interested in learning more about the Gulag, this is it. This is the most comprehensive book that I've ever come across on the Gulag. Anything else anybody wants to hear?
Ann Bauer.
Hi there. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Anne. Hi, Ken.
What a wonderful, wonderful chance to hear about your work. And I'm sort of following up on Elaine's question because I was intrigued. Do you think there's been any kind of a movement in Russia as a reconciliation for this horrible, horrible period of time?
Well, you mean like South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation?
Yeah. Or,
Yeah.
or you think of what has happened in Germany, you know, following the Holocaust.
The Nazis, right, right. The Russians didn't do that. And whether or not they may have thought about it, but they just moved right on with Yeltsin and then with Putin. And they talked about it. Something like Memorial was an effort to do something like that, but there has been no truth and reconciliation. And some people say it's because the corruption, the complicity was so widespread that everybody in some ways had something that they wanted to hide in their closet. Who knows, but they haven't done that. I mean, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that I often ask people there.
Catherine, someone in chat has said something in Russian, I believe, so I won't try to say it because I'll destroy it. If you want to look at that.
Someone says spasiba, Lynn Shapiro. Yeah, spasiba means thank you. Nichevo, Lynn, that means you're welcome. Спасибо вам за слушать меня, for listening to me.
Does anyone else have a question? We're 2 minutes to deadline and we try to keep it to an hour, but there's room for one more short one.
I have to say that I feel very lucky that you were willing to do this. I think it was a wonderful opportunity for me. I really appreciate it. And there are many more things I could have read, but what I'm hoping is you'll read it and find your own favorite parts of the book.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. And Nina, if you want to put on our final slide, and we'll bid adieu until the next talk.